CNBC-TV18, embarking on a quarter century of excellence.
Hello and welcome to Global Eye. I'm Parikshit Luthra. Donald Trump has high chances of returning as the next US president if we go by the recent opinion polls. Trump has a lead over the current president, Joe Biden. According to Wall Street Journal, Trump is leading the race by 47% versus Biden's 43%. Biden's approval ratings are at their lowest point at this juncture. According to Pew Research Center, Donald Trump is a popular candidate among Republicans. 52% Republicans actually named Trump as their first choice for president. 63% Republican voters expect Trump to push hard for their policies. On the other side, Biden's job approval ratings remain low, with 64% disapproving of his handling of his job as president. Similarly, even the Washington Post reveals that 63% Republicans support Donald Trump for the next president, whereas 8 out of 10 Democratic primary voters support President Biden for nomination, but at the same time, they're less enthusiastic about Biden than the Republicans. So what do these polls tell us about Biden's presidentship, and what is really working in the favor of Donald Trump at this juncture? Joining us right now to discuss this further is former political advisor to Bill Clinton, Nelson Cunningham, somebody who's worked very closely with Joe Biden in the past as well. Mr. Cunningham, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. Let me begin by asking you, how do you see the race as it stands right now? Will Joe Biden be the candidate for the Democrats, according to you?
No question. No question. Joe Biden is the only major candidate who's declared. He's got one very minor opponent, member of the House of Representatives. But Joe Biden is the overwhelming candidate for Democrats and will clearly be the nominee.
Right. What do you think is working in the favor of Donald Trump right now? The polls that we see, Donald Trump seems to be leading the polls as far as the presidential race is concerned. Even among the Republicans, he is the favored choice at this juncture. What's working in his favor, according to you?
There's no question that just as Joe Biden is the Democrat, is the person to lead on the Democratic side, Donald Trump is the person to lead on the Republican side. The polls have not budged among Republican primary voters. They have their formal process to go through in the months to come in various states, holding primaries and caucuses. But there's no question in my mind that Donald Trump is going to be their candidate. Why is he doing better in a head-to-head against Joe Biden right now? Well, I'd start with the fact that the world is complicated just at the moment. You have Russia, Ukraine, you have Gaza, Hamas, you have an economy which continues to recover from the pandemic. Inflation has gone way down. We had, of course, global inflation over the last 2 years. It's gone way down in the U.S. from 14% last year down to 3% now. So quite a ways. But the world is complicated. It's easier at this moment to be Donald Trump on the outside and say, gee, if I were president, all these problems would go away, than it is to be Joe Biden on the inside working to fix these problems.
Right. And what are the factors which you feel will be very important in the run-up to the U.S. elections to decide the candidates on either side and also in the presidential race as well?
Yeah. Well, we have 11 months until the actual elections, a little less than 11 months until the actual elections. That is still plenty of time in the American political system for the voters to change their views, for the facts to change, for the voters to change their views, and for the polling numbers to switch. I think the most important thing for President Biden right now is to continue the economic recovery that we've had. We have record low unemployment numbers, record low. We haven't not had numbers this low in 50 years. We have inflation is now down to 3% after highs last year. People are working. The economy is going well. We've had this week record stock index highs. If that continues, I cannot help but think that voters are going to be thinking about Joe Biden in a different way in 11 months.
Right. As far as the war in Ukraine goes, as far as the Israel-Hamas war goes, how do you think is the American public going to react to America's involvement in these wars, the spending that America is doing on these wars? Is that an issue in the elections, according to you?
It is beginning to be an issue. Republicans, who I will remind you, for decades were the strongly anti-communist party that viewed the Soviet Union as the world's greatest evil. Republicans see Vladimir Putin, as many of them, as an acceptable president for Russia and an acceptable ally for the United States, led by Donald Trump, who, during his 4 years of presidency, worked hard to build his relationship with Putin and to build a good relationship with Putin. Republicans are not as strong in support of Ukraine as historically they have been. There's no question about that. Having said that, there is still overwhelming bipartisan support in the Congress among almost all Democrats and a sizable collection of Republicans still in favor of Ukraine and still in favor of supporting Ukraine. So I think we will see that support continue into the new year and onward, unless things change dramatically. With Gaza and Hamas, there is strong support for Israel. There always has been in the United States, but there is growing concern about what's happening in the Gaza Strip, about the number of people who are being killed in the bombing, and especially on the American left. On the American left, you see voters beginning to question U.S. support for Israel. So again, Israel, just like Ukraine, has strong bipartisan support. Republicans support Israel. Most Democrats support Israel. But we're having a vigorous debate in this country right now on this question.
Right. Mr. Cunningham, as we read all these different polls, one thing that comes across, which is definitely going against the Democrats right now, is Joe Biden's age. Will that be a factor if he is up against Donald Trump? Is that something that could go against the Democrats? And is there concern among Democratic voters around that?
Yeah, there's no question the president is the age that he is. Donald Trump is only 4 years younger. So it's not as though we have two young men facing against each other or an old man versus a young woman. We have two men who have many decades of age on them. I think I've been with the president. I'll be with him this afternoon at the White House. When I've seen him, he is vigorous. He is on his game. There's no question in my mind that the decisions at the White House that are being made, despite what you may hear on some right-wing media like Fox News, that Joe Biden is the one making the decisions. He's the one making the calls. He's the one leading the nation. And I think that I would argue that, frankly, his decades of experience in the Senate and his years of experience as vice president have made him enormously well qualified for this position. He accomplished, in the first 2 years of his presidency, he accomplished historic legislative victories that took careful patience, given the Democrats' razor-thin margin in both houses. It took enormous legislative patience and skill, and he got it done. I would argue somebody with less experience could not have gotten that done. Now, are there some voters who are concerned by his age? Absolutely. But as Biden himself always says, don't compare me to the almighty, compare me to the alternative. And if the alternative is a man who's only 4 years younger, I'm not sure for many voters it's going to look like a dramatically different picture.
Right. And finally, when it comes to the Republicans, and I know we were discussing this 3 years earlier when the Capitol riots had taken place, the fact that Donald Trump remains the most popular figure among the Republicans, and even according to polls right now, even though there are 9 months to go, 11 months to go for the elections, the fact that he is in the lead, what does this show about the change in American politics and among the Republicans as well?
There's no question that Donald Trump has changed American politics, and he's changed the Republican Party dramatically from being a party that historically was the party of better educated people, of wealthier people, of the owner class. It's now become a party of the working class. And the Democrats have become the party of the educated, the party of the professionals, of the lawyers, the doctors, the bankers, are now the Democrats. Trump has taken advantage of that and has really shaped the Republican Party in his image. It's now a party that is no longer for free trade. It's no longer a reliable ally to Europeans, to Japanese, to Koreans, to our Pacific allies. He has dramatically changed the direction of the party and its goals. We have to acknowledge that. I think that Joe Biden, meanwhile, has done a remarkable job of holding up America's decades-long commitment to our allies across the Atlantic, our allies across the Pacific. He has done an enormously deft job, I think, in building on U.S.-India relations and continuing to build that very, very important critical relationship in the Pacific region. And so Biden is holding on to a more traditional Democratic stance. Trump has changed things, no question.
Right. So it'll be an interesting race here onwards, an interesting campaign to watch out for. Mr. Cunningham, thank you very much for joining us, and it'll be great to have you on again in the next few weeks as the election season heats up in the United States.
CNBC-TV18, embarking on a quarter-century of excellence.
Shifting focus now to the Israel-Hamas war, there is a sudden shift in U.S. stance on Israel's bombings in Gaza. U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, during his visit to Tel Aviv, said that the United States wants to see results on Israel's intent to avoid civilian casualties in Gaza. His visit came amid tensions between Israel and the United States over President Biden's comments, where he accused Israel of indiscriminate bombings in Gaza. That said, the U.S. is not withdrawing its support to Israel in its fight against Hamas, and that was also seen when Jake Sullivan traveled to the West Bank, which has been now occupied by Israel. But the U.S. does not support Israel's plans to reoccupy Gaza. Jake Sullivan reiterated that the Palestinian Authority needs to be revamped and revitalized in terms of its method of governance. However, Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had said Israel will have the overall security responsibility in Gaza for an indefinite period after the war ends. So where is the conflict headed? Will the United States consider strong condemnation of Israel's aggression in Gaza? And is the war ending anytime soon? Joining me now to take this forward is Clayton Allen, U.S. Director for the Eurasia Group. Clayton, thank you very much for joining us. As we were discussing a short while back with Nelson Cunningham on the U.S. election race, clearly the wars that U.S. is involved in the Middle East and in Ukraine will be an issue in this election. Do you think the politics on the ground is prompting the Biden administration to change stand as far as the Israel war against Hamas is concerned? Do you see an actual change in stand?
Not really. I believe that the domestic politics here in the U.S. are pushing the Biden administration to do exactly the things you just talked about. Publicly call for greater sort of caution in offensive operations in Gaza. Certainly, it's led to the U.S. pressuring Israel to roll back a lot of its air operations over concerns that those are overly damaging to civilian populations. But what you're not seeing a change in is the baseline level of U.S. military support. Two really important facts. One, the White House said earlier this week, in no uncertain terms, it will not condition any future military assistance on a change in Israel's strategies. Second, last week, the U.S. utilized emergency authorities to accelerate weapons deliveries to Israel that are needed for ground defensive operations. Both of those data points suggest that while the narrative is shifting towards greater caution around civilian casualties, the basic level of military support is unchanged.
Right. Now, as far as the Jewish voter or the American Jewish voter in the U.S. election goes, how significant is this as an issue for both the presidential candidates right now, from the Democrats and the Republicans?
It's a pretty significant issue. I think there's three groups to look at. You mentioned Jewish voters. I would also point out younger progressive voters who are by and large dissatisfied with the U.S. approach and are starting to indicate less sort of enthusiasm for Biden as a result. And also you have to remember Muslim Americans who have indicated a strong drop in polling support for both Biden and Democrats more broadly. You know, individually, none of these groups is massive, but they are all very important parts, especially of the Democratic base coalition. So diminished enthusiasm among those votes is definitely a headwind for Biden heading into re-election. For Trump, the issues are, or for Trump or Republicans, the issues are maybe less extreme. There's not really any suggestion that they're losing support or really seeing any shift in support over the U.S. position.
Right. Just to ask you about the recent budget that has been approved by the House, how do you see this defense budget that has been cleared, and what does this indicate about U.S. support for Ukraine and for Israel?
Sure. So just to be clear, this is not a budget. It's just an authorization document. So government funding is still very much an open question that'll be decided next year. What the NDAA tells us, the Defense Authorization Act tells us, is the U.S. is by and large going to maintain its current commitments. There's a focus on rebuilding defense infrastructure here in the U.S. to expand assistance potentially to Ukraine in the future. And there's language that, again, is supportive of the U.S.'s partnership with Israel, which spans back multiple decades and has been a feature of basically every NDAA in years past.
Right. Now, finally, as far as this war goes, in terms of bringing the war to a close, what kind of attempts do you expect the Biden administration to make in the next few months now, Clayton?
So that's the most important question that anyone can ask. And right now, what we're seeing is that the administration is not focused on ultimate resolution. Instead, they're focused on moving the conflict into the next phase. You see that reflected in Sullivan's comments about greater caution towards civilians. You see that in U.S. pressure against ongoing air operations. The U.S. wants to see Israel move away from immediate crisis response and into something that looks more like a longer term and maybe more sustainable security sort of operation. That the ultimate resolution here, the ultimate status of the governing coalition in the West Bank, in Gaza or elsewhere, I think is an open question, and one that unfortunately Washington doesn't have a great answer to right now.
And finally, coming back to the U.S. election, because this is all happening at a time when U.S. is going to polls, and this will be an issue, as you also pointed out. In case this war escalates in the Middle East, will this negatively impact the Biden administration, the Democrats?
Absolutely. Absolutely. An escalation, an expansion of this conflict, an expansion of any conflict would be a net negative for the Biden administration. Right now, the world is lurching between crisis to crisis. Any one of those crises growing larger puts additional strain, not just on the U.S.'s ability to respond militarily, but also economics. It puts additional pressure on inflation, potentially roils global oil markets. All of those things are negative. So absolutely, an escalation in this crisis would be a negative for Biden heading into his reelection.
All right, Clayton Allen, thank you very much for joining us, giving us your view on the Israel-Hamas war and how the U.S. support for Israel will continue, and that is not being questioned at all. Thank you very much, Clayton. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of Global Eye. News continues on CNBC-TV18. Stay tuned.
CNBC-TV18, embarking on a quarter century of excellence.